The food of impressions. This lecture will be eminently psychological. There are 3 types of nourishment, each varying in importance. The first one we can call food. Unquestionably, among the foods that enter through the mouth, and the mouth is there is a mechanism for these aspects that allows for the transformation of the vital principles of life. I am referring to the stomach. Without the stomach, it would not be possible to transform the first type of food. However, the food that enters through the mouth is not the most important. We know well how food is transformed through digestion. There is no doubt that, ultimately, the vital principles are deposited in the blood, and it is the blood that directs them to all the organs of the body. Nevertheless, someone can go without eating for some time. Mahatma Gandhi could go up to 40 days without eating, and even more. He went 2 or 3 months without eating. Thus, food is not the most important. The second type of nourishment is prana, which enters with the oxygen into our physical body through the act of breathing. Unquestionably, there is an organ, or special organs, for the transformation of the food that enters through the nose. Thus, the air of life through the lungs is naturally transformed into oxygen, and this oxygen is later deposited throughout the bloodstream into the blood. Breathing is even more important than the food that enters through the mouth into the stomach, because we could last up to nearly a month without eating, but we cannot survive long without breathing. Normally, one can hold their breath for a minute or 2, and some people can even last up to 3. I have managed to remain without breathing for more than 4 minutes through training, but unquestionably, beyond this limited short time, if we don't breathe, we die. Thus, breathing is more important, in truth, than physical food. Finally, there is a third type of nourishment that is even more important. I am emphatically referring to impressions. Unquestionably, we could not exist for even a second if there were no impressions. We cannot live a second without receiving impressions. Our organism is nourished, most especially, by impressions. If air did not make an impression on our lungs and in our blood, we would not live. If food did not manage to impress the stomach and intestinal tract, we also wouldn't be able to live. Thus, impressions are fundamental. Unfortunately, unlike breathing and the first food that enters the stomach, we do not have, in this case, an organ to digest impressions, and this is regrettable. Air has the lungs, food has the stomach, but what organ do impressions have? They pass into the mind, and we cannot deny that, but we do not have a way to digest the impressions. There is no organ for the digestion and transformation of impressions. All of life's events reach the mind in the form of impressions. All occurrences arrive in the brain in the form of impressions. Joy, sadness, hope, despair, problems, worries, etc., all reach the mind in the form of impressions. Any circumstance, any event, no matter how insignificant, reaches the mind as an impression. I repeat, unfortunately, we do not have an organ capable of digesting impressions, and this is more than enough reason for these to turn into psychic aggregates, that is, into egos. If we do not digest the bad impression we receive, for example, from someone who insults us, then that impression turns into a vengeance ego within us. If we do not digest the impression caused by a glass of wine, obviously, that impression becomes the ego of drunkenness. If we do not digest the impression caused by someone of the opposite sex, unquestionably, that impression becomes an ego of lust. If we do not digest the impression related to a fortune, obviously, that impression can turn into an ego of greed. So, not digesting impressions equals creating egos. Undigested impressions, I repeat, turn into new egos. Thus, we not only have the egos that we carry from previous lives, but worse, we are creating new egos every day, and this is unfortunate. It is essential to stop creating egos. But this is only possible by digesting impressions. But how can we digest them? How can we transform them into something different? Is that even possible? Yes, it is. How? Through consciousness. If we place consciousness between the impressions and the mind, the impressions are digested. Impressions, in themselves, are hydrogen-48, a fairly dense form of hydrogen. When digested through consciousness, they are transformed into hydrogen-24, which serves to nourish the astral body. That hydrogen-24, in turn, can transform into hydrogen-12 to nourish the mental body. Finally, the mental, when digested, transforms into hydrogen-6, which nourishes the causal body. Thus, it is better to digest all these impressions to transform hydrogen-48 into nourishment for the higher existential bodies of the being. Normally, impressions wound the mind, and the mind then reacts against the impact coming from the external world. If we are struck, we strike back. If we are insulted, we insult back. If we are invited to drink, we drink, etc. The mind always reacts to the impacts coming from the external world. We must avoid such reactions, but this would only be possible by placing consciousness between the mind and the impressions. Is there a way, a technique, or practices that could allow us to use consciousness to place it between impressions and the mind? Is there a key that allows us to use consciousness in such a way that it is consciousness that receives the impressions and not the mind? Because when consciousness receives the impressions, it inevitably digests them, transforming them into something different. But when it is not consciousness that receives the impressions but the mind, then the mind reacts violently, mechanically, to the impacts from the external world. How, then, to use consciousness? How can we utilize it, in what way, so that it, and nothing else, is the one that receives and transforms the impressions? I will tell you, the key is very simple. Never forget yourself, your own being. If one forgets their own inner being in the presence of someone insulting them, they will end up insulting back. If one forgets themselves, their own being in front of a glass of wine, they will end up drunk. If one forgets themselves, their own being in the presence of someone of the opposite sex, they will end up fornicating. When one learns to live in a state of alertness perception, of alertness novelty, when one remembers themselves moment by moment, instant by instant, when one never forgets themselves, they inevitably become conscious. If one does not forget themselves in the presence of an insult, if one does not forget their own being, then they transform those harmful impressions into hydrogen-24, which serves to strengthen the astral body, into hydrogen-12 to nourish the mental body, and into hydrogen-6 to nourish the causal body. That is, they transform the insulter's words into a different force. If one does not forget themselves in the presence of a glass of wine, they transform that impression, that hydrogen-48, into hydrogen-24, 12, and 6. If one does not forget themselves in the presence of a large sum of money, they transform that impression into hydrogen-24, 12, and 6. So, not forgetting oneself is the key that allows us to intelligently manage consciousness. When one does not forget themselves, they place between the mind and the impressions that which is called consciousness. The beauty is that consciousness is the one that receives the impressions from the outside world, because consciousness can transform them into something different, into creative elements, into superlative elements of the being, into diamond forces that serve for the development of the chakras, into multiple forces that serve for the development of certain powers that exist within our internal constitution. It is necessary to know that all the egos we currently have are the result of undigested impressions, untransformed impressions, and this is regrettable. Unfortunately, people never remember themselves. That is why impressions reach our mind and remain there, completely untransformed, giving rise, as is natural, to psychic aggregates, to egos. It is necessary to dissolve the egos, but it is also necessary to stop creating more egos. Someone might have the luxury of dissolving the egos, but if they forget themselves, they will create new egos again. This is the serious problem. Self-remembrance is something interesting. When one remembers themselves, they generate forces entirely different from those of their fellow humans, distinct forces, forces that make one a completely different person from others. It is interesting to know, then, that those who generate such forces become different. Even their life potencies multiply. If we placed two people in a hostile environment, with poor nutrition, bad surroundings, etc., one who never remembers themselves, who lives a mechanical life, and the other who always remembers themselves moment by moment, who always recalls their own being, who never forgets their intimate being, you can be absolutely sure that the first would die quickly and the second would live despite the hostile environment, because they are surrounded by forces different from the others. The entire problem of liberation is based on transformation, and transformation is grounded in sacrifice. Notice that all life is transformation. Thanks to the infinite transformations that occur within the maternal womb, the human organism can form. If we observe, for example, an egg, whether of a snake or a bird, we see latent possibilities, susceptible to development. These possibilities become a reality through transformation. The fire in the fireplace, which warms us during winter days, is the result of transformation. Digestion, within us, is a whole process of transformation that makes existence possible. The transformation of air within the lungs is another process of transformation, and if we want to transform ourselves psychologically, we also need to transform impressions, which are the third type of food. I repeat, all life's events, which reach the mind, come in the form of impressions. I am speaking to you, gathered here in this hall, in this lumisiel, and what is reaching your mind? The impression, a series of impressions. You see a man speaking to you, and you hear him. These impressions are reaching your mind, and at this moment, as I am speaking to you, are you sure you are digesting this impression? The impression of seeing a man speaking to you, giving you esoteric teachings? Are you already in the process of digesting, or transforming, or not? If you are not in the process of digesting, or transforming this impression, of seeing Samael Aun Weor in front of you, speaking, then you are wasting time, unfortunately. Why? Because you are not digesting the impression, you are not transforming it. If it is not digested, it is not transformed. Prior to transformation, there is the digestion of the impression. How do you digest this impression? Seeing a man here, in a white robe, giving a lecture. Well, by not forgetting your own being. Let the being be the one who receives the teaching. Pass all the teaching to the being. Listen with the yearning to reach the being. If you digest the impression, you will understand it better. If you do not proceed in this way, you are wasting time, and this lecture would be, for that reason, useless. Thus, we must begin with facts, because he who hears the word but does not act is like a man who looks at himself in a mirror and then turns away and leaves. So, it is not enough to hear the word, we must digest it, and that is precisely what is fundamental. See how important that event called impressions is. You could not live even a second without impressions, not even a fraction of a second. Thus, it is worth transforming them into something different. Into power, into light, into fire, into harmony, into beauty. But if we do not transform them, they, I repeat, even if I become tiresome with the repetition, simply turn into new psychic aggregates, into new egos. It is necessary for us to be more reflective, just as we are, in truth, as we find ourselves, without digesting impressions, creating new selves second by second, moment by moment. We are nothing more than simple machines controlled by psychic aggregates. We live in a world of great activity where everyone believes they are doing something, yet no one does anything. Everything happens to us, like when it rains, like when it thunders. Why? Simply because we have not embodied the being. Only the being can do, the being does, and the true man is the being. But if the machine acts, something that is not the being is acting, a robot programmed with a marvelous computer called the brain, acting mechanically. So, it is not doing, it is acting. One thing is to do, and another is to act. Any machine acts, moves, walks, performs its functions because it is a machine and has been programmed for its functions. But doing is something different. Only man can do, and the true man is the being. Let us distinguish between the true man, which is the being, and the machine. The machine is not the being. I repeat, the intellectual animal is a programmed robot, and its brain is a marvelous computer, a computer that sustains itself, one that mathematically calculates, with precise accuracy, the vibrations it needs for a cerebral, a computer that registers visual and sound waves, that records the external and internal, and that sustains itself. It is a first-class computer, wonderful, but it is just that, nothing more, a computer. This computer has a physical organism and uses it to go here and there, etc., etc. Such a computer is in the hands of the ego, not the being, and the ego is the result of many undigested impressions. So, what is acting in this painful world we live in is a machine equipped with a great computer. It is not the being acting here, but the machine. We could say that the machine is a machine, and the being is the being. But what is, in truth, this thing we call life? Certainly, it is like a movie, yes. When the hour of death comes, we return to the starting point of that movie, and we carry it with us for eternity. Upon returning, when all this ego comes back, it brings its movie with it. When it restructures with a new physical organism, it projects its movie again on the screen of existence. And what does it project? Its life. Which life? The same as always, the one it had in the previous existence. In other words, it repeats what it did in the past existence and in past existences. All that it projects is programmed, from birth, in the brain. So we are programmed robots. The being has no involvement in this whole tragedy. It does not meddle in these affairs. The being of each of us moves freely in the Milky Way. There are and live here, in this painful valley of life, a lot of shadows equipped with physical organisms. But what do these organisms do? Nothing. They move mechanically, according to the program that has been deposited in the brain, and I do not mean only the physical brain but the three brains, the intellectual, the emotional, and the motor. And the being, what does it do while we are here suffering, struggling, crying, fighting to pay the rent, to buy a suit? What does the being do? It lives and moves freely in the Milky Way. So, what is this painful existence we lead? Pure illusion, something vain. Rightly so, the Hindus say that this world is pure Maya, that this world is illusory, that it has no real value. We need, I repeat, to have real existence because we do not yet have it. Would any of you claim to have real existence? Which of you has real existence? Yes, my friend. It seems someone is raising their hand. Don't tell me you truly have. There is a pause. I see here nothing but machines that move, programmed machines, programmed robots, nothing more. Obviously, we need to stop being robots, and we can stop being them. But to stop being them, we must eliminate all the psychic aggregates, that's obvious. You already know that we have to eliminate the psychic aggregates. But knowing this is not enough, we need to stop creating new aggregates, and daily, we are creating them by not digesting impressions. We need to digest the impressions, transform them into different forces so as not to create new selves. And we need to digest the old impressions, the ones that gave rise to the selves we currently have. This is possible through reflection, self-observation, and elimination. When one digests the old impressions that are deposited in the 5 cylinders of the machine, in the form of habits, lower emotions, negative thoughts, depraved instincts, sexual abuses, etc., then those inhuman elements disintegrate, turning into dust. So, we must not only digest the new impressions that come to the mind, but also the old impressions. And they are digested, I repeat and clarify, by self-observing ourselves from moment to moment. We need examples, and I will give them. Suppose that, suddenly, we are jealous. A man discovers that his wife has another man, and of course, the self of jealousy jumps out there. What to do? He has discovered the self of jealousy, that's obvious. The law of recurrence says that in a past existence, the same triangle existed, and in an even earlier one, the same triangle existed. Thus, those feelings of jealousy are due to an undigested impression, not transformed. If one then tries to digest that impression, let's say, into something different, if through reflection, one comes to the conclusion that jealousy is absurd, that it has no real sense, then one makes a digestion of that bad impression that comes from ancient times. And by doing that digestion, one is in the best position to disintegrate the ego. All that remains is the plea to Devi Kundalini Shakti, for her to disintegrate that ego, resulting from an old, undigested impression, and finally, that ego of jealousy turns to dust. Let's suppose we get into a fight with someone because they don't want to return some money we need. Undoubtedly, this is an undigested impression. If, when we went to collect the money, that person didn't want to pay, and we felt a great frustration and the desire to fight with that gentleman, then we must be understanding enough to, upon returning home, meditate and try, through introspective means, to digest that negative impression. There is no doubt that the law of recurrence has worked there as well. There is no doubt that in a past existence, through the law of recurrence, the same case occurred. We lent, to that same person, a certain amount of money, and they didn't return it. And in the previous lifetime, the same thing happened, and in the one before that, the same, and it has always happened the same way. Because of this, we created a self of hatred against that gentleman. Now, we will need to completely digest that bad impression, which comes from a distant past, and is now turned into a self, to digest it through reflection, understanding that this issue of money is vain, illusory, that at the moment of death, we don't take even a cent to eternity. When we become conscious of this, we will then plead to Devi Kundalini Shakti to disintegrate that ego, which is nothing more than the result of a series of undigested impressions. And surely the Divine Mother will turn it to dust, and we will be free from that bad impression. All ourselves are nothing but the result of untransformed, undigested impressions. Once these undigested impressions are disintegrated, the forces from those impressions transform into something different, into hydrogen 24, 12, or 6, and one is left cleansed. Thus, past and present impressions must be transformed into cosmic and divine forces, and this is possible by not forgetting ourselves, not forgetting our own being. When one does not forget oneself, when one lives in a state of alertness perception, of alertness newness, then one transforms those impressions into something different. If someone manages to transform all their impressions, they will be truly blessed, because the being will remain in them, and they in the being, and then they will have real existence. Then they will indeed be able to do, because they will have the being incarnated. As we are now, we are nothing but programmed robots. Those undigested impressions were deposited in our three brains, and those impressions are repeated moment by moment throughout our lives. This is the mechanics of the law of recurrence, a repetition of old impressions. Do you think it's pleasant to be machines, to play the role of robots, to not have the being incarnated, to live like this, as shadows, in this valley of tears? Do you think it's worth having such an existence? And what are we? Miserable shadows, programmed robots, programmed by the old impressions of the past. All the impressions from our past existences that were left undigested have been deposited in our three brains and now are repeated mechanically. So, we appear to be real robots. We are robots, moving automatically in this valley of tears. How long do you want to continue living as robots? Until what year? Until what date? Reflect on this, my dear brothers, because truly it is a pity to be a robot. That concludes my lecture. Now, before I close this teaching, those who want to ask questions may do so freely, and those who disagree should say why they disagree. Student: when an impression has been transformed and moves from hydrogen 48 to 24, then to 12, and finally to hydrogen 6, can it continue from hydrogen 6 to hydrogen 3? Master: yes, it can continue to nourish the higher existential bodies, and it can even reach hydrogen 1. Bear in mind that one can not only create the astral, mental, and causal bodies but can also have the luxury of creating the 4 kayas, which are Nirmanakaya, Sambhogakaya, Adhikaya, and Dharmakaya. Obviously, the fine hydrogens needed to nourish that kind of vehicle must come from right here, from this physical world in which we live. They must emanate from or come from transformed impressions, or in other terms, from hydrogen-48 transformed step by step, gradually. Student. Master, is self-remembering simply a psychological attitude, like thinking, I am here, with a present awareness of ourselves? Master. If you say, I am here, you might be affirming the robot. You are simply affirming the robot. The robot says, yes, here I am, there is the robot. That's not the point. The point is to not forget your own being, which is something different. The being lives normally in the Milky Way and is not currently incarnated in the robot, because the ego and the being are incompatible. The point is to not forget the being. It's not about affirming the robot, but about affirming the being, which is distinct. Any other questions, brothers? Student. Venerable Master, since the human body, or the machine, doesn't have, let's say, a way to digest impressions, since food is for the stomach, air for the lungs, who could digest the impressions in a disembodied being? Master. What do the disembodied beings have to do with robots? Student. Well, it's just my question, that's all. Master. No, impression, as this glass I'm drinking from, by the way. This Tawakan water is delicious. Impression is, for example, that mechanical device. Impression is what you eat, what you drink, what reaches your mind through the senses. All of that is impression. Impression is to exist, to live. Joy, sadness, what brings us worries, what brings us desires, what brings us hope, what brings us despair, all of that is impression. What do disembodied gentlemen have to do with this drama? Nothing, right? When it is said that impressions must be transformed, it means an instrument must be used. Which one? Consciousness. But whose consciousness? What is it? Why does it exist? Consciousness belongs to the being, and when one does not forget one's own being, obviously, consciousness is functioning. Not forgetting your own being is extraordinary. Why do fallen angels exist? Because they forgot themselves for just one moment, enough time to plunge headfirst into the abyss. Not forgetting oneself. I'm not saying this means affirming the machine, the robot, no. Not forgetting oneself means not forgetting your innermost being. That's what I am emphatically referring to, and it must be understood in the light of a transcendental, revolutionary psychology. Any other questions? Student. Venerable Master, a person who has never experienced the being and who has not. What psychological attitude should they take for self-remembrance and to affirm the being within themselves? Master. The personality must become increasingly passive, so that we become receptive. When one becomes receptive, they begin to feel the being more and more, through the higher emotional center. For it is written, Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. We must cleanse the heart so that emotional understanding emerges within us, which is much higher than cerebral understanding. Any cerebral reasoning, no matter how grand it may be, is very poor compared to emotional understanding. Emotional understanding allows one to feel the being. Thus, what we need is, as I have said, to pay attention to the development of emotional understanding. It develops, more and more, as we cleanse the heart, that is, as we eliminate the psychic aggregates. If at first there is only a residual, incipient form of emotional understanding, as we disintegrate the ego, this emotional understanding will become increasingly visible, more adept. Let us not forget the being. Let us always pay attention to the tranquil heart, and thus, in reality, we will not create new egos. But while we forget the being, impressions will reach the mind and remain undigested. Then they will become new egos or strengthen the already established egos in the 5 cylinders of the organic machine. That is obvious. Student. Venerable Master, sometimes one feels that an ego is acting, for example, anger. One realizes that they have anger, They want to understand the phenomenon, why it caused them anger. And yet, one does not feel the desire for the anger to go away because the ego is strong. What should one do then? Master. Obviously, the ego of anger, fully established in the 5 cylinders of the machine, has become, in this case, the master and lord of the entire machine. However, there is a small margin, very limited, indeed, of freedom that can be used. Speaking in terms of analogies, we could say that this margin is as small as that which can exist between a violin and the case that contains it. It is very limited, indeed, but if we use it intelligently, it can be expanded. We must appeal to the obvious self-reflection of the being, and we must also appeal to self-observation. Observe that ego of anger in action. When oneself observes during an attack of anger, they understand that something distinct from oneself, has entered their brain and taken control of it. If one has verified, through self-observation, that reality, they can take another step, which is the step of obvious self-reflection. And if, through obvious self-reflection, they conclude that a demon of anger has taken over them, then they can take the third step, that of deep inner meditation. Through meditation comes superlative analysis. One must reflect, one must clarify in the mind what happened for the anger to arise. And then they discover that this ego of anger has other roots. It could be self-love. It could happen that someone hurt our self-esteem. Or it could be that someone wounded our pride. It could happen that someone hurt our sensitive mind, or that they hurt our vanity, etc. If one manages to discover the cause of that anger, then they understand that this anger is futile. And if one understands that this anger is futile, they are in a position to disintegrate it. It would only be necessary to implore Kundalini Shakti for her to disintegrate such a psychic aggregate. I am sure she will assist you in the process of disintegration. That is the obvious path to follow. Any other questions? Student. Master, does inspiration play an important role in all this? Master. Well, the best initiates say that there are 3 scales leading to initiation: imagination, inspiration, and intuition. Is that clear? All the brothers are filled with inspiration. There is no one who does not feel inspiration. But one thing is inspiration, and another thing is the objectivization of consciousness. No matter how inspired one feels here, if they have not managed to disintegrate the egos, their consciousness is not objective. And if their consciousness is not objective, even if they always feel inspired, they will not reach enlightenment. To reach enlightenment, it is necessary for the psychic aggregates to disappear. Only by disappearing does objective inspiration emerge within us, authentic, which leads one to the highest scale of intuition. We must disintegrate the psychic aggregates, and they could not be disintegrated if one does not live in a state of alert perception, of alert newness. Any other questions? Student. Venerable Master, what role would the force of the third logos play in psychological work? Master. Well, there is a very elevated Trimurti, which is the Father, the Logos, and the Holy Spirit. Undoubtedly, the Holy Spirit is the sexual force. This sexual force develops, unfolds, and processes in the fiery forge of Vulcan. If we invoke Kundalini Shakti, precisely in the forge of the Cyclops, she will assist us, strengthened by the power of the third logos, that is, the Holy Spirit, and she will quickly disintegrate the psychic aggregate that we are interested in disintegrating. That is how the Holy Spirit, Shiva, or the third logos, as you say, plays its role in the work of disintegration. Let's see. Student. Venerable Master, how did the great master Ashiata Shimash manage to transform impressions? Because you informed us that this master was not fallen. Master. Ashiata Shimash, the great avatara of Babylon, undoubtedly managed the total disintegration of all psychic aggregates. Thus, he did not forget himself. From moment to moment, from second to second, he digested the impressions. Thanks to this, he became the essential beloved. That's all. Any other questions? Student. Master, I would like to know if the remembrance of oneself would be, then, like reaching a state in which one provokes the search, a deep longing to find the being, and that keeps them during the 24 hours of the day, so that the mechanical world does not fascinate them? Master, in self-remembrance of one's own being, it is clear that there exists the force of longing. This is vividly expressed through emotional understanding, which allows one to not. It allows one to digest the impressions. That's all. Any other questions? Student. Venerable Master, you spoke of making the personality passive so that the essence becomes active, that is. Master. The personality becomes passive as we eliminate the psychic aggregates of 96 laws. There are certain heavy aggregates that undoubtedly control the false personality. These aggregates that are said to be of 96 laws include vanity, pride, egoism, violent anger, self-love, jealousy, hatred, egoism, self-importance, intolerance, etc. If we eliminate such psychic aggregates, the personality becomes passive. Undoubtedly, the personality in a passive state is receptive. It can receive the messages of the being that come through the higher centers. Thus, in this way, little by little, we learn to obey the orders of the higher parts of the being. But the personality must be made passive through the elimination of the psychic aggregates of 96 laws. Student. Who would be the transformer from hydrogen-48 to hydrogen-6, Venerable Master? Master. The total transformer of hydrogen-48 into hydrogens-24, 12, and 6 is consciousness. Student. One question. When an impression transforms into an ego, due to being asleep, what happens in the brain basically, in the main transformer? Master. Well, it is certainly not the brain that transforms impressions. The brain does not have the power to transform impressions, it leaves them untransformed, which is why they become egos, psychic aggregates. Only the superlative consciousness of the being can transform impressions. But for the consciousness to function, we must not forget ourselves, our own being. What was our brother going to ask here? Student. Is there any special organ for the impression to transform into an ego, in any part of our organism? For example, one observes a woman, and this impression transforms into a new ego of lust. Does this transformation process in some part of our organism? Master. You know very well, as a doctor, that the spinal column, in its coccygeal vertebrae, ends up, ultimately, in a sort of tail. This is what the people commonly call it, horsetail. Student. Horsetail. Master. Horsetail. That little bony piece is a remnant of the abominable Kundartigador organ. In the past, humanity possessed the Kundartigador organ fully developed. So all human beings carried. They carried. We carried. Why should I become the exception here? No. Student. Laughter. Master. We carried the famous tail that today the monkeys, gorillas, and apes have. That tail or Kundartigador also has the power to transform, thus, impressions into new egos. Unfortunately, it was due to that abominable organ that all existing impressions transformed into the multiple psychic aggregates that came into existence. Since then, consciousness became bottled up in such aggregates. Well, that organ disappeared thanks to the feverish activity of the Archangel Loisos, great cosmic engineer, but a remnant remained here, and it is that horsetail. That remnant still has the power to transform impressions into egos, into new egos. Any impression, no matter how insignificant, can be converted by that bony particle into new egos, into new psychic aggregates. That's all. Student. Master, what is the reason that it is men who are more interested in psychological death and not women? Master. Well, the question is a little mistaken at its core. Student. No, Master, it is just that in dealing with ladies and in dealing with men, I have been able to verify that men are always the ones who take the initiative regarding psychological death, and they fervently desire to die, and not she. Master. Well, I will tell you a great truth. The question is a little mistaken because I know in the Gnostic movement some ladies who are truly interested in dying because they have dedicated their entire existence to the process of disintegration of the ego. So, not all women are like that. There may be many ladies who are not interested in eliminating the ego, I do not deny that, but that does not mean that they are all ladies. There are also many men who, upon hearing this body of doctrine, become interested in the disintegration of the ego. However, there are also many men who do not have the slightest interest in the dissolution of the ego. We have many students located in different countries in South America who do not care in the least about the disintegration of the ego, who are only interested in the development of the chakras, in initiations, in grades, in powers, but who have never thought about disintegrating the ego. Despite having studied my book titled Revolutionary Psychology, with deep sadness, I must tell you that among all the correspondence I receive, which is quite a lot, I have not read